Talking about the materials for drawing in ink and some of the techniques. First of all, Bristol paper. We also need something to fix the paper too so we can lean it at an angle. Ink, of course, something to put the ink in. You're going to need a pencil and eraser so that you can draw in proportion. A skewer helps with visual measuring when you're doing it from life. Toilet paper or paper towels to clean up with. Plain paper can be used to mask. Tear it into pieces and then set it up and you can mask from splattering. The pens and nibs need to fit together properly, so make sure that the handle and the pen nib that you're using fits together. Also, they're fragile. Make sure you're using them correctly with the points on top when you put pressure down. Even the bamboo pen, it can be a little bit fragile, so you've got to be careful with it. As far as the brushes go, we have the bamboo brushes and the toothbrush for flicking and splattering. But if you want to use some nice watercolor brushes, like the Isabey brush there, you can. You could also use something as weird as a stick. Both the tip and the end can be used for ink. Something like bubble wrap could be used to give texture to your drawing. Just regular roll salt can be used to create texture. So these are the materials we're going to use. We also have to take into consideration our setup. Use an old towel, put it in your lap, and you can take the drawing board and tilt it so that you can get the washes to look correct. The first type of wash that I want to teach you to create is called a flat wash. This is really why we need to tilt the paper. This is why we need to place the panel in our lap so that the paper is at about a 45-degree angle, because you can see here as I'm walking the wash down the page, it's running and collecting at the bottom. If you dry off the brush, you can use it like a mop and soak up the excess. A gradient wash is very similar to a flat wash. You do it at an angle. But instead of continuing with the same ink, you dry the brush off, switch to straight water, and you start to dilute it as you go down. If it's not diluting fast enough, you can use the paper towel or the brush and dry that off, and then continue, and it will give you a nice fade from the ink to the paper. You can then add to it. In this case, we're going to get a little bit darker at the top. And while the ink is damp, while the paper is damp, it's a surface that you can work with. And it's important to keep in mind that you're not always working wet ink on dry paper. So as you're working with ink and damp paper, you can do a lot with it. Like in this case, I am soaking up the excess, and now I'm kind of feathering it out with a little bit of water in my brush, just a little dampness in the brush. And it's very sensitive. And so while your paper is damp, while it's wet, you can work with the ink and create soft edges. So you just have to have a good touch. Practice these techniques. What I'm doing here is just showing you the techniques. I'm not creating a finished drawing. I'm just showing you the techniques. And so managing how much ink is in your brush, how damp the paper is, all of these things are things that you can consider when you're trying to get harder and softer edges. And it can be very effective. When we're working with the pens, the first thing that we want to be aware of is the size of the pen nib and the weight of the lines. When we're hatching, the weight of the line or the thickness of the line and the spacing between the lines will have an impact in the overall value that we'll see standing from a few feet away. So we want to be conscious of the pen nib that we're using. If we use a heavier pen nib, we're of course going to get a heavier line. And one of the reasons for using these pen nibs, these dip pens, is that we can put pressure on them. And you can see here as we're putting pressure on the pen, oops, we could just fill that in real quick. So thick lines, thin lines, these give us lighter and darker values, but so does cross-hatching. And so when we use hatched lines that change directions and cross over each other, they essentially stop out the white of the paper and they create a darker tone. So cross-hatching is used as a way of creating areas or shapes of value from light to dark. And if you just look for the changing directions, you can allow more or less of the white paper to show through and create lighter and darker tones respectively. It doesn't have to be used just on white paper. Hatching and cross-hatching can be used in conjunction with ink washes. And when you hatch and cross-hatch on top of a wash that is fresh, as you can see here, the ink is sort of bleeding out into the wash a little bit because the wash is still a little bit damp. So it can give you controlled qualities of line. Here, stippling, just putting little dots next to each other. Of course, all of these techniques that we're using with the pen, when we see these from a few feet away, they look more like shapes or masses of tone, not like individual lines or little dots. And so the stippling is being used here very sensitively with the cross-hatching to extend that tone. And now, while that ink is damp, I'm applying another wash and allowing the ink to kind of run into that wash. All of these techniques can be used in conjunction with each other, and they will create beautiful drawings. So once again, I think it's a good idea to practice these techniques on your own, on a scratch sheet, before you commit to drawing something, person, place, or a thing. What you're seeing here is the use of just a standard Crayola crayon, just a white crayon. And we're going to use that to reserve the highlights. It's wax, so the ink's not going to stick to it. You're also seeing here how the ink is being layered on top of each other. And so as you're layering ink washes, they of course are going to get darker. And what I'm doing here is I'm just wiping off the brush, and I'm kind of brushing over those areas that I used the crayon on to kind of soften the edges just a little bit while the ink is still a little bit damp. Now here we're going to get a little looser. We're going to use the ink in a few ways. Like if we add a little bit of water to this ink while it's fresh, it'll bleed into it and create some nice effects. So it spills into it like that. It kind of has its own natural sort of qualities. Here I'm using the toothbrush. Always pull towards the brush so it spatters on the paper, not on your shirt. And here I'm putting a little bit of paper down in the corner to mask off the corner as I'm spattering, flicking the paint. So these are just some rough techniques. You got to practice and play with this stuff. Now, if you have opaque white, this is just white gouache. It's just opaque watercolor. If you don't have this, that's okay. It wasn't on the supply list, but we talked about it at the beginning of the semester. You can use white gouache or opaque watercolor or whiteout, any kind of white material with brushes and the pens to kind of, I don't want to say go back on the ink or, reverse it. It's really about just working with values, really. The thing is that this only really You can only go so far with it really with the pen. It's really better with the brush. Okay, so I just need for you guys basically to think about the techniques that you've just seen and use them in conjunction with the techniques that you've been using all semester long to get good proportionate forms and good spatial relationships between the forms that you draw. So start with the techniques like the envelope shape, organizational line drawing, visual measuring, negative shapes, geometric shapes, continuation of edge. Use these techniques from the beginning of the semester that we've used all semester long. Use them with a pencil and establish your forms and establish the composition. And once you've done that, draw out the light and shadow pattern, draw out the core of the shadow, get the notan worked out, and then get the ink out and start working with these techniques. But practice these techniques first. Do some scratch sheet drawings just like you saw in the demo, and just practice the techniques without committing to trying to do something with them, so that when it does come to actually working figuratively, you'll feel comfortable with certain aspects of these ink techniques. You don't have to use all the ink techniques that you saw in the demo. Some of them might stand out as being more salient for you. And so if you're more into hatching and cross-hatching, or if you're more into ink wash, that's fine. You don't have to use everything. But you do have to use ink. And I look forward to seeing what y'all are going to do. So enjoy the drawings. Communicate with me if you have questions. You know how to get in touch with me. And I'll talk to you soon. Okay, bye.